Silence in court, all rise.
Morning, be seated please.
CICS 1 of 2022, Commission's own motion, 2022 State Wage Order pursuant to Section 50, capital A of the Act.
Yes, good morning. We'll take appearances. Mr Entrican for the Minister.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. Yes.
Thank you. Mr Moss for the Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner.
Dr Diamond for Unions WA.
That's correct.
And Mr Twomey for WACOS.
Thank you.
Good, thank you very much for that. Well, we can record that we've received your written submissions, both the initial submissions and your reply submissions, which you can take we have read. We also have a written submission from Professor Preston at UWA, which you are all no doubt aware of, and those submissions, in accordance with our programming directions, are available publicly on the Commission's 2022 webpage. And also these proceedings, as you know, are webcast today and tomorrow if necessary. I think consistent with what we had previously agreed, we're going to first hear from the Minister, and I believe first from the presentation from Mr Christmas on behalf of the Treasury. Then we'll hear from CCI, then Unions WA, and then WACOS, and of course you'll all have a right of reply in the usual way. Additionally, as we have previously programmed, we'll have some submissions on or about the 3rd of June in relation to the national accounts, and we'll resume again once the Fair Work Commission annual wage review decision is handed down. Okay. Are there any preliminary issues we need to deal with before we get underway from anybody at the bar table? Well, Mr Entrican, over to you.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. If it pleases the Commission and Court session, we'll begin with the usual presentation by our expert witness from the Department of Treasury on the economic outlook for Western Australia, and this will be followed by an opportunity for questions, and then I'll briefly summarise the Minister's position. If it pleases the Commission and Court session, I'll now call Mr Christmas to the witness box.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr Christmas, if you'd please come forward. Thank you.
Please state your full name and address.
My name's David Brian Christmas and my address is 28 Barrack Street, Perth.
Do you sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence that you shall give to this Commission shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please be seated. Thank you, Mr Christmas, and welcome back again, and thank you for your assistance in these proceedings.
Thanks, Chief Commissioner. Yeah.
Mr Entrican.
Thank you, Mr Christmas. Can I confirm that you've made a witness statement for these proceedings?
I have.
Great. And that was witness attachment B to the Minister's submission. If it's convenient at this point, Chief Commissioner, I seek to tender the PowerPoint presentation that Mr Christmas has prepared
Yes,
today.
thank you. We might actually deal with both the statement and the PowerPoint presentation. So the witness statement of Mr Christmas will be Exhibit Minister 1, and the PowerPoint presentation will be Exhibit Minister 2. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got some spare copies here for the,
yes, thank you very
the parties.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if the commissioners themselves require copies.
I think
or
we
if you
have one. Thank you very much.
Copies? No problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Mr Entrican.
Very good. Thanks, Chief Commissioner. Mr Christmas, could you now please take us through your presentation?
Thank you. And thanks for this opportunity. Just before I get into the actual presentation, I should note that the presentation is basically based on assessment of the WA economy and the outlook as published in the 22-23 budget, which was tabled last week. As noted in the budget papers, while the global economic outlook has deteriorated over the recent months, Western Australia's domestic economy, as measured by state final demand, is forecast to grow by 5.25%, the strongest growth in a decade, with solid growth of 4% expected in 22-23. Growth in the state's economy is being driven by exceptionally strong growth in consumer spending, as well as rebounding investment and elevated levels of government investment. These factors are driving near-record demand for labour, with the unemployment rate forecast to fall to just 3.75% from 22-23, down from an annual growth rate of 4.2% in the year to March, already the lowest of the states. And I might note that today's data release suggests it's going to be a bit lower. So all this presentation is based on data before this morning's release. Strong labour demand and limited supply are expected to see wages growth lift from an estimated 2% to 2.75% in 22-23. And the strong domestic economic conditions combined with national and global supply chain and geopolitical factors are driving elevated inflation, with the consumer price index now forecast to increase by 4% in 2021-22. These inflationary pressures are expected to ease somewhat over the next year, with CPI growth forecast for 2.75%. And then with the reopening of international borders, services imports such as WA's West Australians travelling overseas are expected to lift sharply over the next 2 years, detracting from net exports and moderating growth in overall activity. So that's the basic gist of what I'll be.
Yes, thank you.
So just the global and national context first. Essentially, growth, global growth is rebounding, and 21, or it did rebound in 21 after a decline in 2020, and now it's growing. So it grew at 6.1%, and now we're expecting that to moderate, or the IMF rather is expecting that to moderate to 3.6%. In its April 20 World Economic Forum, the IMF forecasts a slowdown to 3.6, and that's lower than its forecast as recently as January, which was 4.4%. So the global outlook's deteriorated because of several factors, but persistent and rising inflation prompting central banks in many nations to tighten their monetary policy. More transmissible strains of COVID pose challenges, and particularly in China. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine disrupts global supplies of key raw materials and adds to overall climate of uncertainty. So notwithstanding that the outlook's deteriorated, it's still growing at slightly faster than, it's forecast to grow slightly faster than its average rate for the last 30 years of 3.4%. Commodity prices have been supported, including because of the issues in Ukraine. The main driver of our commodity price index, as you'll probably be aware, would be the iron ore price, and that did reach a record high of $236 a tonne in mid-May 2021. It then fell sharply to $87 US per tonne, and that was largely because China wanted to moderate steel production, including, I think, ahead of the Olympics, because it can be pretty, just the coal used in the production can create smog. And it's partly because they didn't want the property market to be, well, probably more actually, the property market not to be overheated. But then economic activity, I think they thought that they'd gone too far and started to say, well, some more positive noises. The central bank made some changes to ease conditions, and that has since led to a recovery in the price. Although I would add So at budget cut-off it was $151 per tonne, so that's on the 11th of April, and now today it's about $126 per tonne. And that's partly because of concerns, I think, about how... so it's probably not so much the strains in China, but it's their reaction. They're really clamping down on Omicron. Oil prices also have been rose substantially, particularly because economic growth has been stronger up to the end of last year than we were thinking globally. And also, once the Ukraine crisis happened, obviously Russia being taken out of the system, upward pressure. The Aussie dollar is around 73 cents over the year to date, and likely reflecting, it's about, I think, just over 70 this morning, and likely reflecting the faster increases in interest rates in the US than Australia. And some concern about China. In terms of the national economic forecasts, the Australian economy measured by GDP grew by 4.7% in calendar 2021, strengthening from 1.5% growth in 2021. In its own budget, which was released early on the 29th of March, the Commonwealth outlined its assessment of the outlook. And part of that was it did revise up its estimated growth for 21-22 to 4.2%, and then growth expected to moderate after that. And the uplift was basically because of stronger momentum and particularly consumer spending in the labour markets. Again, like our own labour market surprised us on the how strong conditions were. And they do note that notwithstanding the pandemic and new shocks such as Queensland and New South Wales floods and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that the economy, recovery is well underway. So the unemployment rate they forecast to fall to 4% in the June quarter 2022. And ease further to 3.75% next year. The strong labour market is expected to see WPI, the wage price index, increase over the next couple of years. And reflecting the strength of the economy, but particularly that strength is flowing through to consumer prices. The Reserve Bank has raised its target cash rate by 25 basis points in May, and that was the first increase in 11 years, and it's had been steady at 0.1 or 10 basis points since late 2020.
It seems like from the minutes of the last meeting there might be more on the way.
Exactly. Yep. Yes, that's right. They actually say. Actually, in the statement that the Governor released on the day, he basically said more on the way as well. So turning to our own economy, household and business confidence, consumer sentiment has turned and softened considerably in recent months, likely reflecting fuel prices and the recent rate rises, and there's been some rate rises by banks in advance of the actual formal cash rate rise. So it's not just the cash rate; there's been some anticipation of it, and obviously that's the trend isn't a good one, and but I'll get back to that. And business confidence has picked up recently after softening in the second half of 2021. Using the National Australia Bank's measure of business confidence, it's actually it also releases conditions report at the same time, and conditions, according to it, are pretty good right now as well. That dip sort of in that second half of 21 is I think largely related to concerns of lockdowns over in the eastern states and whether that might impact on us because we had our own lockdown in June-ish. It was brief, but, kept it in everyone's mind, I think. So while consumer confidence has weakened, data to March actually shows we're still spending strongly. And if you look at some of the, so some banks do put out some information on what they're seeing through their own channels, and some of that would suggest that is also consistent with spending remaining robust even beyond March. So we have to say, while consumers are concerned, they're still spending at high levels.
There's almost a contradiction in there, isn't there?
Yes.
Declining consumer confidence, but record retail spending.
Yes, there is.
Not quite sure what that means, but that's what it is.
Yes, that's just how it is. The actual spend may actually reflect that employment outcomes and the labour market outcomes have been so strong, and that's offsetting concerns about rate rises and inflation.
Sure.
So it is actually sort of very strong rates of growth in household consumption. As you can see, it's not only non-discretionary, it's discretionary spending as well. So non-discretionary has sort of been supporting household consumption for a while, but discretionary has not been supporting it for a while, and at very long last that's picked up, which is good to see. The only area of weakness really, so in almost every industry except tobacco, which has been declining for a long while, spending's back at pre-COVID levels or more, in most cases, and pretty much more. The only one that isn't is transport, and that accounted for about 3.8% of pre-COVID spend, and that is largely because international flights account for 10% of that measure, and at the moment spending 70% down on December 2019 levels. So there's a bit of growth coming in from that, which is why we do think next year we'll have, there is a point where we'll have extra growth from that. So household savings rate is really quite strong. So the net saving rate is 20% in 2021. I would sort of add that we've had a look at household consumption data, not nominal household consumption data, and nominal compensation of employees aggregate data. And for us, our consumption is still below our compensation of employees, which would suggest that there's still some saving going on. And nationally, that it hasn't been the case for the last 2 quarters. So essentially, we do see that our consumption estimates are very strong for this year, and we're sort of estimating in the order of 5%, and then declining, but still being stronger than the past decade, so to 2.25%, and then building up to 2.75 for a year, and that's sort of reflecting that sort of recovery in international and spending, travel.
It's interesting, in previous cases we've often seen higher rates of savings but less consumption. Now we have high consumption and high savings.
Yes.
So it's almost, again, another interesting trend, which is different to what we've seen previously.
Yeah. I think some of the reasons for that, at least sort of early in the pandemic, was government support. So there was an awful lot of support.
Huge stimulus in the economy.
Yeah. and then since that recovery in employment has really supported incomes, our house prices, which there's a wealth effect as well, have increased, but not nearly as much as they have over east. But that does also give people a bit of a feeling of
confidence
yeah,
to go out and spend.
yeah.
Sure.
So all those things have been supporting why they spend, and then obviously the income side, it's government, and then recently it's that employment. But also there are remuneration that's not just your base wage. There's sort of bonuses and things that are helping.
Incentives and other things that are creeping in.
Yeah. So the housing market really received a big boost from the state and Commonwealth government stimulus measures from June 2020 and sort of the latter half of 2020 you had this big increase in sales. However, subsequently those have come off, and one of the reasons they've come off is that buildings are taking longer to build, significantly longer. I would note though, and that's a rolling quarterly, but just in the last sort of March data, we are seeing that construction commitments increased from 656 in February to 739 in March. So that actually was an increase in the month of March, and also an increase in the number of building approvals by 5.1% in March. So we may be getting to the bottom of that sort of dip. So turning to what that means for our investment, we've been revising our forecast for dwelling investment several times now, just because labour and material shortages have just stretched out building time. So typically dwelling commencements can take between 6 and 9 months, and then maybe in boom-like conditions 12 months. What we're seeing now is something closer to 21 to 24 months, and a lot of those buildings that were started have still got to be completed, and that was June 2020 was not far away from 2 years. So I look out every week for are these completions data picking up, and they still haven't. The last time I looked, which was about a week or 2 weeks ago. So using HIA, they do a weekly data dump. So what's that done is flatten the forecast profile. So we're still expecting investment to increase by almost 13% this year, but to basically flatten off at the same sort of level as you can see in that chart before a brief dip and then lifting again in the out years because population is going to resume growing. And as I said, we're just starting to see maybe the end of that dip. And land sales data, which I haven't shown you, but does show that came off a peak, but it's now stabilised at levels that are slightly above pre-COVID levels. So there's a reason to think it'll, because land sales, given that construction's taking so long, will filter out towards the outer years in terms of build time. Yep. So one of the things that has held up really well for us relative to over east, or nationally, is business investment, and that's been supported by those big backfill iron ore projects. So Gadaidri Iron Bridge and South Flank Eliwana, there's a whole lot of them. So that has really been good in supporting our investment profile. And then going forward, and so they have underpinned this sort of pick-up in investment since sort of a trough in, looks like 18, 19. And we're still expecting it to increase next year. So we've got a forecast now of 8.25% for next year. And that, we believe, will be supported by LNG taking over the key driving role. So the Scarborough project, which was sort of given financial approval late last year, and Jan's IO construction compression project, both, that's still a large project in its own right. Not as large as Scarborough, but it's still large. They should take off, plus Eneabba Rare Earths Refinery, Marjorie Salt Project, and a range of non-mining things, including in the city, ECU campus, potentially a third runway, Garden City shopping centre expansion, that sort of thing. So going into the domestic, wrapping all those things to get a picture of the domestic economy, we're sort of seeing it growing now at 5.25% 21-22, and that's the fastest rate in a decade. And even next year, we're expecting it to ease to 4%. You can see that's higher than that sort of historical average rate. So we've got a couple of years of very good growth, and then 3%, which isn't that much lower than the historical average. So we're going through a good period in the domestic economy. The external sector is where things are probably going to be softer. So a lot of these through the mining boom, we really expanded our productive capacity, but that sort of ended a few years ago, and now the investments are really, particularly in iron ore, are backfilled. So they are increasing production, but at more marginal rates than they used to. So we are expecting exports of iron ore to increase this year, and we're also expecting the high iron ore price is going to prompt maximum throughput, and then sort of next year would expect LNG will be a bit more of a contributor, but overall you're not looking at big changes to merchandise exports. What is a different story because of the pandemic is, if you on the right hand of that panel, you can actually see our net services exports briefly touched a surplus. But as West Australians tend to spend a lot more than we get in terms of international visitors, tourism-wise, or even through education. And so we would expect to go back to a net services deficit over the period. So that will be detracting from overall growth as well. One area that has been quite good, well, very good, is the agricultural exports, which are the Grain Industry Association of WA is reporting 24 million tonnes of grain production in 21 season, and that's compared to the previous high of 18.2 in 2016, so it's in the order of 30% higher. So that is going to be providing a significant boost to our exports. That said, ag's not a big share compared to mining, but it is a contributor. So there's a key word missing here. So that should say under WA's GSP is expected to grow by 3.75% in 21-22, underpinned by strong domestic economic growth. So we are expecting growth to be a 3.75 in 21-20 to be the fastest in 8 years. And because of that sort of slower, more moderate contribution from the external sector, 2% next year, and then very softer growth in the out years. Population growth, we are expecting that to pick up. So from 0.9, it's still an estimated 0.9% this year, to around 1.5%, which is still below the long-run average of about 1.7%. And we're expecting net overseas migration to pick up now that COVID restrictions have been relaxed, and so we're expecting it to increase to around 22,000 by 23-24, 15,000 next year, and we're talking less than 3,000 this year in our estimates. That said, interstate migration has actually been positive in the last couple of years, so that's helped support our growth. Although we've just made the assumption that'll sort of return to longer term levels by the end of the period. So a combination of those things are seeing our growth go to around 1.5% by the end of the, by 24-25, and continuing at that rate. So labour market, employment and hours worked are both at or near monthly levels, record monthly levels. And employment's hit 1.464 million as of last month. So employment has more than recovered, so 5.8%. Our employment levels 5.8% above pre-COVID levels. Hours worked have also reached a record high in January, although they did ease in February and March. I was told by my labour market analyst that the extent of that easing has been revised, so it's even smaller in today's data. But even then, there are declines of 1.8 and 0.9, and those aren't that's sort of within the range of monthly change that you saw in 2019. So you can't draw too much from it, but hours worked due to fewer hours. There were people working fewer hours than usual in WA due to illness, and that was 60% above March, based on the data up till today. That compares, though, to Victoria and New South Wales, where at least one of those states was 250 times the previous usual. So it's multiples of people rather than 60%, which is so. Up till today, I mean, I don't know enough about today's data, it only just came out, but we hadn't seen big Omicron effects in the labour market. That's probably my point. Anecdotally, I mean, there you do hear about absenteeism because of cases, but I can't quantify that until we see the next bits of data. Employment, in terms of full-time employment, has grown strongly, 5.7% over the last year, and contributed a bulk of 3.9 percentage points of growth. And part-time employment in annual average terms did increase as well, so by 6.3%, and contributing 2.1% to the annual average growth to March. But as you can sort of see here, full-time employment's been sort of increasing at about 0.6% per month over the year 21-22 to date, compared to 0.2 per month for part-time. And growth in part-time has slowed since following a wave of rehiring after most jobs lost at the outset of the pandemic were part-time, and you can see that was much more affected, and it's bounced back. Employment by industry has been very strong in particularly healthcare, not surprisingly, I think, given you've had a pandemic. But other industries are sharing in the growth, so mining, public, so administration, but importantly retail trades there as well. Mining added about 11,700 people 750 people, and public admin and safety and retail both added about 8,650 people between February, the 4 quarters to February this year compared to the 4 quarters to just before the COVID outbreak. Advertised vacancies are at record levels, so that bodes well for future employment growth. It may also be indicative of businesses having trouble filling advertised roles, so they're just re-advertising sort of thing. So there may be a bit of an element of that as well. But notwithstanding that, it's not on this occasion, it's not as dominated also by mining as it was in the last boom. I should have ideally shown that, but I can at least let you know that. Yes, more broad-based.
Anecdotally, you hear employers advertising for weeks and months, in fact, sometimes, and not getting any successful outcomes, which is an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and there's a lot of I suppose, given the opportunities, also people. There's so much opportunity and such a limited pool, I suppose. So in terms of our employment growth, 5% this year, and in fact that's sort of coming, our estimates sort of a little bit lower than the current annual average rate. That I think partly reflects a quarter of weakness dropping out. So that's sort of consistent. That record growth is consistent with the state's recovery being very robust. Employment is then forecast to grow by 2% as momentum continues, but that's 2% on top of 5%, so that's just worth bearing in mind. Unemployment rate as of yesterday, as of till this morning, had fallen to 3.4% in March, and it also reached that level in December, and those were the two equal lowest rates since December 2008. And that's really well down on its peak of 8.5%. And other evidence, the underemployment rate has eased significantly over the COVID period, and it was 6.7% in March. Over the year to date, in 21-22 to date, so it's not the full year, but the underemployment rate has averaged 6.8%, the lowest average underemployment rate of all states. Nationally, it was 7.8% for that period. And I'm using that because there is volatility. You can even just see it there, the volatility in the unemployment rate on a monthly basis. And the underutilisation rate, which adds the two, has averaged 10.7 over 21-22 to date. Again, well below the average other states and the national average of 12.2. In terms of youth, the annual average youth unemployment rate has fallen sharply to 9.9%, its lowest rate since 2014. As of yesterday. So again, all of the signs are pointing to good labour market outcomes, and this reflects the whole. I suppose this is the headline indicator. Unemployment rate averaged 3.9% in the first 9 months of 2021-22. And the tight labour market conditions are expected to mean it averages 4% in 21-22 before easing to 3.75% over the remaining period. But that's well below the historical average of 6.1 and the decade average of 5.5. Participation as yet another indicator of the strength. So WA's participation rate reached a record of 70% in February 22, and that was the highest participation record of all states of all time, all in our recorded series. And even over the 12 months to March, it was 68.9, which is extremely high. And what that's doing is drawing people who are probably in the more cyclically sensitive or more elastic part of the labour force in. So you can see from that right-hand panel chart that quite a lot of older cohorts are being drawn into the labour force. And it's worth noting that there's been a stronger lift in participation for females than males, with the female participation rate reaching a record 63.7 in the 12 months to March 22. And female employment has now also risen to a record of 692,200 persons. As you'd be familiar, we use the wage price index as our preferred measure because it's less prone to compositional effects. But it also means that probably it's not capturing all the remuneration that's going on. The headline WPI grew by 0.5 in the March quarter and by 1.9% in annual average terms, which is the strongest growth since June 2016. So that's why I put starting to lift there. After several years of subdued growth. What we are seeing...
lower than what was forecast, generally.
Yes, it has been
Consistently been forecast as higher than it
has eventuated, yes, that's right. I suppose, so the reasons we would think it is going to increase are the type, and I'll get to that in a second, but I'll do it now. So the next thing, here again you can see that disconnect. The reason why we've got this, what we call a tightness in, an indicator of labour market tightness. So it's basically the number of vacancies divided by the number of unemployed times 100. And really, you'd expect, it has actually, travelled pretty well in the past, but there's just become a disconnect. But you are at last probably starting to see something happen. What you're also seeing is in other measures of remuneration, so AWN and WOTE, you can see they're between 2 and 4 percentage points growth in the latest sort of annual average measures. So some of those will pick up some of these remuneration forms. There is a non-headline WPI measure, and in the private sector, at the state level, private sector, which does include bonuses. So it's not in the headline main indicator that everyone looks at, partly because that indicator is meant to actually measure the price of labour for a specific quality or for performance, a standard level of performance. And once you include bonuses, sometimes that's for performance or the performance of the business or the person, and maybe both. So that's not necessarily seen as the headline one. And so if you include bonuses, private sector wages increased by 2.4% relative to private sector wage growth of 2.1%. So wages in the private sector are growing faster than the total WPI, and if you look at bonuses as well, that's even faster. And we do know from payroll tax data that there's been quite a lot of
bit of activity in that area, and incentives and various other things.
Yeah. And also WPI wouldn't sort of capture movements or people being promoted because it measures, it's sort of a basket which has constant positions, and also if people move across from businesses, you won't necessarily get that either. So there's a couple of reasons why measured growth may not be capturing everything that's going on. That said, and if you talk to the RBA, their liaison program is showing quite a lot of evidence that there'll be increase in wage growth. So 65% of firms nationally reported they're planning to increase wages by more than 2% in 2022. And Michael Page also has suggested that it's a recruitment firm, suggested that in a report that 28% of national employers are planning 3 to 4% salary increases. So there's reasons why there's anecdotes, and I think the RBA is also saying when they've had a look at it, there is some inertia when you have agreements that last across periods. So there is an element of that as well, which may also be contributing. And there's no doubt the public sectors, and it's not just here, but across Australia, outcomes are softer, and that's also keeping headline down. I should just put a response to another point I would make, and you are seeing in there's a couple of industries where annual average growth in WPI is above 2%. So manufacturing, it's 2.3%, construction 2.4%, accommodation and food services 2.5%, professional, scientific and technical 2.4%, and admin and support services is, well, no, that's actually 1.9. So it's very close, but there's a few there already that are getting into that space. And so that's sort of all that together is suggesting to us that at some point in time you'll expect that increases to be in the base rather than sort of continuing to be just avoiding increases in the base by one-off payments and the like. And that's sort of supporting our view that we think we'll have an increase in wage price index to 2% in 21-22 and 2.75% in 22-23, rising to about 3% in the later years. So just on inflation, Purchasing Consumer Price Index, excluding the electricity sub-index, grew by 4.4% in annual average terms in the year to March. And that's our preferred measure, and for the following reasons. Year-ended growth is volatile and it can be heavily influenced by a factor that might impact on the... So it's in this case, March quarter 2022 or March quarter 21. And if either quarter is impacted, you can have
a distortion.
A distortion, yeah.
Annual rate, yeah.
Yeah. And also the household electricity credit artificially moderates headline inflation in 2021. So it actually was reduced the inflation in that year and then boosts it this year in 21-22 because it's not treated as it was a reduction in the cost of electricity to households in 2021, and now it's household costs have gone up, but it's really just because the government...
true cost has been restored.
Yeah,
in effect.
That's correct. In fact, as this next chart will show, that's the Perth CPI electricity sub-index, and you basically just recovered. It's actually slightly higher than the pre-household electricity credit level, but not it's not much. The residential electricity tariff itself has only increased by 1.75% since 2019-20. So just going, you can this chart, the previous chart, you can see why you can see that year-ended growth is very volatile, which is why we forecast in annual terms anyway. but also the household. So that if you use annual average, that gets you to 5.2%, but that's also still being skewed by the
Electricity
household
component.
Yeah. So after all that, you get to a 4.4% increase.
And I think you're forecasting 4% at the end of this financial year.
That was our estimate, the budget. And that just, you can see how in the year to March we got to the 4 in another way. So consumer price index, in terms of we do see growth easing. We're estimating that the headline index excluding electricity credit will be 2.75% next year. That's the budget forecast, and essentially we're expecting some of the one-off pressures to start dissipating. So, globally there has been supply constraints and restrictions. So the Shanghai Containerised Freight Index reflects that, and now it's starting to come down. Motor vehicles were growing quite strongly, and you can see that. That's actually the motor on the left-hand panel, the motor vehicle component of Perth CPI, and the quarterly rate has really come off from the peaks. So those are two examples, but we know, the March quarter data would have been also added pressure in WA because of our local supply chains being disrupted, including because of the east-west train line being cut, and they had to use trucks, which, and then there's an extra cost involved and all that. And so the costs locally would have gone up because of freight costs, for example. And then the shipping freight, it looks like we're having this reduction in containerised freight rates globally, which is all in the right direction. The market has also been expecting fuel prices to come off, and you saw a bit of that, and it's now that sort of went back up. But even today, I noticed that I think it was the Brent price dropped about $5, so it is pretty volatile. But I think that's partly reflecting perhaps China has had some weak data, and also the US stock market has been sort of softening, so there may be some concern about global growth. So that profile just sees us tapering ultimately to mid-range of the RBA target, which they have been fairly successful in the long term achieving. So just to summarise again, really, we're going through a period of very solid domestic demand, and in fact, it's been quite robust. Gross state product is going to be strong this year, and that is all filtering through to labour market conditions that are very robust. There's some temporary pressures on consumer price index that are causing it to go up this year. And then we're also expecting that tight labour market conditions to flow through to the wages. Just in terms of my last slide, it always happens to be the risk. So that outlook is subject to a whole range of risks, hopefully not materialising, but there are risks associated with how the pandemic develops globally and nationally. There's risks associated with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how that plays out. Does it end quicker, or does it broaden and stay prolonged? The extent to which high commodity prices are sustained, and whether that flows through to the real economy in terms of higher investment, higher incomes, or higher costs. Could be all three. The speed and magnitude of which central banks globally raise policy rates, and finally the extent of the labour supply and material supply shortages. So that's sort of things are looking really good at the moment, but nevertheless there are these sort of latent
Risks
risks.
on the horizon which
Yeah.
need to be considered,
Yeah.
yes. Indeed. Thank you very, very much, Ms. Christmas, for that. Mr. Entrigan, do you have any questions?
I don't have any specific questions for Mr. Christmas. Thank you.
Mr. Moss?
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. I've got a few questions. Mr. Christmas, you identified that the growth for China is expected to drop from 8.1 to 4.4%. Is there a view from Treasury about what impact that will have on the WA economy?
So China's always been, we're not expecting a decline in our exports, so in that sense we're not expecting an impact on current production levels. If anything, when China softens, and some data that came out at the start of this week did say it was going to soften, it did show things are softening, including industrial production and a few other indicators. Just I think in response to the lockdowns in Shanghai and some other cities, and I think so you sometimes the response, it depends on how that goes, might be more property and infrastructure investment. So even if that doesn't promote more in volume, an increase in volumes, it might be supportive of price. And even if it did result in a decline in volumes, there may be a price offset in terms of incomes. But we're not expecting, our forecasts aren't. 4.4% is still pretty respectable growth. Any other economy, you'd think that's great. So we're not building in a big risk. You've seen our forecasts, and we'll stand by them even in that context.
No, thank you very much for that. With respect to the business investment, you've identified it's predominantly driven by investment in the resource sector. Is there any indication about what proportion of business investment is resource driven, as distinct from in other sections?
All I can say is a substantial amount. Most of our large projects are in that sector, and even some of our I don't have the number offhand, but all I can say is it's the overwhelming majority of our investment is in the resources sector.
So it would be right to say a very, very large proportion of that.
Yes, well, a very large portion, yeah.
With respect to population growth, to what extent is Treasury concerned about net migration, either interstate or overseas migration, as being necessary to help reduce the impact of labour shortages?
Well, obviously we're expecting that overseas migration to pick up substantially, and current levels we are expecting, I think, just going back to that sort of slide there, expecting population, here we go. You can see that even in 21-22 right now, interstate's still holding up. So that will be important to the flow of new labour into the state.
Is there a particular view as to why interstate migration will start to peter off?
That's more of you can see that our domestic growth does ease towards the end of the period, and that's reflecting that business investment levels growth is moderating, and not only that, the same as household spending is an example. So it's just a normalised. We're assuming that it just goes back to longer term rates as an assumption, but reflecting that SFD growth is moderating from its current strong levels.
Does it also sort of reflect the fact that it has been traditionally difficult to entice people from over east into Western Australia?
Well, if you have a look at the chart, you can see that prior to SFD, sort of the business investment boom ended sort of 2011, 12, 13 sort of thing, and prior to that, you could see we were able to get quite a few interstate migrants coming to WA.
Thank you. That's all the questions I had. Thank you very much, Mr. Christmas. Thank you,
Thanks,
Chief
Mr.
Commissioner.
Dr. Diamond, anything from your point of view?
Yeah, thank you, Chief Commissioner, and thank you, Mr. Christmas. I wanted to just bring up some of the. We made a submission about some of the differences between the mid-year economic reviews forecast and the most recent state budget forecasts. Specifically, some of the estimations for real wage growth have really been pushed out in WA to 2023-24. Nevertheless, WA Treasury is forecasting a lower CPI growth for 2022-23 than the Federal Treasury. So that's 2.75% versus 3%. So, and given that, notwithstanding the issues you've raised about measurements of CPI relative to in March, which I'm going to get to, nevertheless, we do have a higher CPI in March than the national CPI of 5.1%. So, why has real wage growth keep being pushed out further and further for years, notwithstanding all of the sort of positive indicators for growth that appear to be in the budget?
Well, as I respond to one of the Commissioner's observations, that we have consistently overestimated wage growth. That's, the latest data is still consistent with that actually slow growth being pushed out, because like many forecasts, including the RBA, it's always surprised us on the downside.
So why do you keep underestimating or overestimating?
I suspect it's a measure, an issue of timing. As you could see from that labour market tightness and wages, you'd sort of expect that, the difference between those two indicators can be sustained for a while, but it can't be sustained. You wouldn't expect it to be sustained forever, and sometimes you pick it too early.
But it does seem to keep being sustained.
Well, it has been sustained, and that's partly because employers have been using things like one-off incentives and payments, bonuses, rather than using a base wage increase, and that's, they've been able to sustain that for a reasonable period.
And employers have felt that they can do that. They've obviously felt sufficiently confident that sort of the situation is on their side, that they can use one-off payments and bonuses.
Well, that's how it's played out. So whether they're confident or not, that's the reality. So I'm not in a position to comment on their confidence, but I can comment on what's happened.
Okay. Well, in that case, I might move to the attachment that was to the initial submission from the Minister.
Yes, that's the economic outlook.
That is the
Yes,
economic
thank
outlook
you.
document. So I'm looking at part 6 under wages, where you do indeed go, or Treasurer I should say, does go into rates of growth in wages being subdued despite the tight labour market conditions. Businesses have been using a range of ways to attract and retain people without building increases into base wages, as you just said. Targeted bonuses, one-off payments, and some non-wage benefits as well. Now, wage increases or base wage increases would be compounded each year in a way the way that one-off bonuses are not. So does Treasury regard targeted bonuses and one-off benefits as generating the same level of sustained increases in incomes as would a wage increase?
Without having it quite clearly, when you don't build something into a base and it's one-off, it's not going to keep contributing to that level of income. That's just, you're asking whether that's correct. Well, that's generally how it works.
Okay, thank you. So just turning back to questions around inflation. So once again, I'm referring to the economic conditions and outlook attachments. This time I'm going to part 7. Where you do give an explanation, I think, of how excluding the electricity subcomponent gets Treasury a Perth CPI increase of around 4% for 2021-22. And you explain how doing that reflects the unwinding of the household electricity credit. Now, I apologise to my colleague from WACOS if I'm stealing his thunder here, but the WACOS submission has provided evidence that household power disconnections and the need for assistance have seen a significant uptick since the end of the moratorium and the impact of the $600 payment. Now, you've referred to the distorting effect of the electricity component as artificial. But would you accept that if households are getting disconnected in the wake of the uptick and that they're having to apply for things like household utility grants and things like that, that is in fact a real impact on households from a movement in prices, in this case the electricity component?
I think I'm not saying that it's not and it's not concerning, but what I would say is that without the electricity, households benefited from the electricity credit and the price returned to what it would have been without it. So there was a net benefit to households in aggregate terms of the household electricity credit.
But not necessarily in specific terms of households that found that they were on the wrong end of the change.
Well, that households would have received that. Households received it, but the counterfactual is they wouldn't have received it. So they're net beneficiaries in the sense that it was provided.
Okay.
That's not to say that it's not unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And not to say that it's not a real increase from the point of view of those households.
Well, my point is, without that household electricity credit, they would never have had they wouldn't have had the original reduction.
But they might still not have had the real wage growth either, based on Treasury forecasts about when real wage growth is meant to kick in.
I'm just, you're conflating, I think, real wages and CPI here and the household electricity credit. My comments are strictly that households benefited from something that they were given, they were provided with, which they would otherwise not have been provided. That's the only comment I feel comfortable making.
Thank you very much, Mr. Christmas.
Thanks, Dr. Dunn. Mr. Trummy, any questions from BACOS's perspective?
Yes, thank you, Chief Commissioner. Mr. Christmas, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the issues of your confidence in the projections around rising wages, because we've all been concerned recently looking at some of the recent and historic figures, and in your charts around the unemployment and participation rates, we're seeing record lows and record highs that we've never seen beforehand. And yet when we're looking at those same periods, we haven't seen any increase in a meaningful way in wages. And I think the concern at the moment, I guess, is that the question to what extent you have confidence in your projections going forward, that there's simply a lag, or is there actually something that has changed in the way these things are operating that is seeing the disconnect between what we would usually predict? Because, like, I'm thinking, for instance, that we've seen this pattern over the last decade, and we have had statements in the past, for instance, from the former Finance Minister, Matthias Cormann, saying low wage growth is now a deliberate feature of the economic system that we've developed. So I guess my question here is because, I mean, one of the things that you showed there was the chart around the youth unemployment rate. And we've heard similar things last week when we were doing our budget briefing around disability employment. So we've got record lows in unemployment, but in a whole pile of these other groups, we're not seeing any increase there as well. And so something quite strange is going on there. I guess, so my first question is around your confidence in those projections. How confident are you that you're going to see wages rising overall, and what is it that's actually going to drive that?
Well, we're confident enough to put it in our forecast. Even notwithstanding that we know we have underestimated in the past. You can actually see in terms of AWEA and WOTI, which you'll be familiar with, that you're actually getting, according to those measures, between 2 and 4 percentage points in annual average terms and growth anyway. Yeah. So you are actually seeing it in some measures of wage or remuneration.
Yeah. Okay. Well, can I ask a question about that? Because you were talking about the impact of bonuses being something that was hidden there. To what extent would you say that we'd expect workers on the state minimum wage to be receiving those sort of bonuses? Are they the type of people that are going to get that, or would they need to see a lift in the state minimum wage to be able to keep up with those in the economy who are more likely to get bonuses?
I don't have the firm data in front of me. What I do know is that, one of the sectors where bonuses and the like are being used is the mining sector, and they tend to be higher income sectors. Yeah. And beyond that, I don't have data or information to be more definitive, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The Chief Commissioner raised some kind of observations earlier about the seeming contradiction between consumer spending and consumer saving. Do you have any kind of data or evidence about the different groups involved there? Because I know we'd heard some stuff anecdotally saying that the spending through the stimulus measures last year was happening particularly among younger people, and that older people, particularly baby boomers who'd experienced previous financial downturns, were saving all the money. So is it quite likely that we've actually seen a polarisation there between who's spending and who's saving and on what?
Yeah, I don't have the information to provide you with, an answer to that. I'm looking at the aggregate data.
Yeah.
And that's... Yep.
So I guess kind of going to that, when it comes to some of the projections around CPI and consumer confidence going forward, do you have any kind of measures of inequality that you look at as well when you're considering kind of the health of our domestic economy? I'll explain. I mean, one of the concerns that we've got at the moment is that we're in a strong and healthy economy as far as WA goes in very general terms. But from our point of view and from the point of view of our services, we've seen a rise in inequality, and we've seen a rise in demand around people in financial hardship. And so our concern is that there is this growing gap that gets hidden there. But from our point of view, when it comes to the state minimum wage, that is something that is incredibly important for us in addressing that. And so it could well be that we're seeing a growing group of people whose wages have been falling behind the real cost of living, but they're not necessarily showing up there in the charts, and for some reason their wages just aren't kind of being driven up as we'd expect them to be. Is that a fair comment, or do you think there's problems with that?
Look, I obviously don't have data on every group,
Yeah.
right? But some groups have. So if you look at stuff like long-term unemployment, that's gone down. Medium-term unemployment, that's gone down. So there's the youth unemployment, that's gone down. So there are some indicators that are saying that there's the benefits. There is some broad-based benefit.
Yeah.
Our forecasts are based, though, as you know, on a macro view of the world, for sure. But that does include looking at in some of those indicators. We'll monitor some.
Looking at how much youth unemployment has come down, as you say, are you surprised that when overall unemployment has been so dramatic that youth unemployment has changed comparatively little and still remains comparatively high as compared to, say, a decade or two ago? See, you're still looking at 9 or 10% there for WA and for Australia, and at a time where we're saying this is record low unemployment.
Yeah.
And to my mind, that's unexpected and something very strange going on there. Wouldn't you think so?
Look, the rate is, it's always good to have more people employed, including our youth. What I find encouraging out of that chart is things are moving in the right direction.
Yes.
Although, you know, desirably lower, and I don't know what today's youth data result was, but given the unemployment rate dropped a fair bit, that might even be better than that picture suggests.
Okay. Final question. So I guess our considerations here are around what are the mechanisms that are going to result in the rise in wages that you're predicting into the future. And I suppose one of my concerns at the moment is that some of the trends that we're seeing aren't necessarily there. Do you know what your kind of expectations or predictions are going forward when it comes to the balance between what's the contribution of public sector wages versus private sector wages to that, as to how important is going to be the determinations in the state minimum wage in contributing to that growth that you're saying needs to happen to balance things out into the future?
Well, the latest public sector wages is move away from the $1,000 per year to a number of options that are both substantially higher than that. So again, that move to public sector wage growth you can expect to increase.
Yeah.
And so that actually will contribute to the wage price index growing over time.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Rowe.
I've got a couple of questions, if I may. Yeah. Can we go to slide 7? And it seems to me that the RBA target and the standard variable are diverging as time goes on. Is that correct?
According to this, it is, yes.
Yeah. And is there anything that we would make of that? Like, what would you explain why that's occurring?
So in terms of actual rate setting by banks, I'm not an expert in that space.
So is
So-
it essentially the banks are not necessarily just
Passing it on.
automatically following?
That's correct.
So we can't assume that just because the RBA target is this, that the banks will do.
They generally move with it, but obviously, clearly, some of those most recent moves they certainly haven't
Yeah.
shared. Yeah.
Okay, and slide 13.
I should say that's one. It's a standard variable. They do use other
Yeah,
types of loans, introductory loans, which are cheaper than.
yeah,
So yeah.
okay. And slide 13, I'm just interested in what the assumptions are in the forecast for the moderating growth.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's things that households have been doing that we wouldn't expect would be sustaining. You don't buy a new vehicle, most people wouldn't do it every year or 2 years. They'd buy it for a certain amount of time. So there's been quite a bit of that vehicle purchases, for example, or household furnishings, because you're particularly at the very early stage of the pandemic. But I think also a lot more people working from home. They want their circumstances or their environment to be nicer. But once they've made that, it's probably going to be a little while till they do another purchase. So you've sort of almost brought forward some of that. So the high rates have a little bit of bring forward, which is why you have that moderate. It's one of the reasons for those moderation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Mr. Christmas, I think Mr. Moss asked you a question about business investment and the focus of that being in the mining industry. And I wondered if you had a comment about whether it's limited, the benefit of it's limited to that sector, or if there are flow-on effects or it impacts more broadly.
Mining investment, total investment, and largely been mining investment, does have, in my view, flow-on effects, because you, to the extent that you're using local labour, is going to be using non-mining goods for food, for dwellings, for other things. There'll be a flow through to the rest of the economy, because generally mining will, at least for the period of projects being built, boost employment.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much again, Mr. Christmas, for your helpful contribution. We do appreciate it greatly. It does assist us in determining the broader economic picture, both within Western Australia and Australia-wide. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Commissioners. Thank you, Chief Commissioner.
Ms. Chentrigan, when you're ready, please.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner, and thank you to Mr. Christmas. We note that Treasury's undertaken a significant amount of work to assist with today's proceedings, and I know that David's team have put a lot of effort into that, so we thank them sincerely for that. I'll now move on to the Minister's position. The Minister relies primarily on the written submissions already lodged with the Commission, but I'll take the opportunity to reiterate the basis of the Minister's position and to just briefly address the positions of the other parties. To start with, the Minister recognises the importance of maintaining a strong and meaningful safety net for wages and conditions for employees covered by the state industrial relations system. The state wage case process plays a pivotal role in protecting the needs of the low paid and ensuring their living standards are maintained and improved in line with those in the broader community. This is the third state wage case that's taken place since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's an event that continues to create challenges for employers and employees alike as we learn to live with the virus in an ever-changing environment. The Minister notes the Commission awarded a 2.5% increase in minimum and award wages in last year's state wage audit, and that was in line with the decision of the Fair Work Commission in the National Annual Wage Review. The West Australian Government welcomed that decision at the time, which assisted many low-paid workers to maintain their standard of living following a challenging 12-month period. While COVID has posed many unique challenges, the Minister notes the West Australian economy continues to display considerable resilience, and that's underpinned strong employment growth and the highest levels of job vacancies that we've seen. As demonstrated in much of the data presented by Mr Christmas this morning, most economic and labour market industries are now well above pre-pandemic levels. Western Australia's tight labour market conditions have seen unemployment fall to the lowest level in many years. In fact, I note that this morning's figure was 2.9% unemployment for Western Australia, which is quite low. And we've also seen, with robust hiring conditions, have seen more people join the labour force, and that saw the participation rate reach a record high of 70% in February this year. While the state's economy has been buoyant, the Minister notes that in recent months there has been considerable volatility in some of the key data sources that ordinarily feature in state wage case deliberations. And the pandemic's undoubtedly contributed to some of that volatility, particularly with regard to inflation. And it's the pandemic certainly had an impact on labour and material shortages in key industries and significant supply chain disruptions. However, there's also been other external factors besides COVID that have been present, including the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has had a significant impact on international fuel prices, and also the closure of the East-West Rail freight line, which Mr Christmas talked about a few minutes ago as well. The Minister acknowledges that inflation is currently elevated, both in Perth and at a national level. As noted in the Minister's written submission, there's a variety of global and domestic factors that have recently put upward pressure on the CPI. While headline CPI growth is at the highest level in a number of years, the pace of inflation is expected to moderate in the coming financial year as many of those temporary price pressures begin to recede. Notwithstanding this, the Minister understands that many West Australian families are experiencing increased cost of living pressures, which is one of the reasons that it announced a range of initiatives in this year's state budget to help ease the burden, including a $400 electricity credit for all West Australian households, and that in turn will also influence the headline CPI rates for the next couple of years as well. The Minister notes that rising inflation is also an impost for many employers, as higher input costs can affect local businesses, and that can create cash flow challenges as well. Also of relevance to many workers and employers, on the 3rd of May, the Reserve Bank of Australia lifted the official cash rate target. And that is the start of what's expected to be a series of interest rate increases as the RBA begins a cycle of monetary policy tightening, which is designed to bring the underlying inflation rate to within its target range. The RBA has indicated, as Mr Christmas discussed as well, that there's anecdotal evidence that wages growth is gradually starting to pick up, as confirmed in the latest ABS data for the wage price index, which was released yesterday. And while wages growth is still relatively subdued, the latest annual growth figures for WPI in Western Australia are nonetheless the highest they have been for a few years. And indeed, the private sector WPI in Western Australia, which was, I believe it was 0.7% for the quarter and 2.4% year on year, was a bit higher than the overall rate as well. Given the volatility in the prevailing economic climate and the fact that there's a number of key data sources relevant to the state wage case that are still being released or have just been released, the Minister has not recommended a specific quantum for minimum and award wage adjustments at this point in time. The Minister submits that any increase that is awarded in this year's state wage case proceeding should take effect from the first pay period on or after 1 July 2022, in line with normal conventions. By granting a fair and reasonable wage increase, the Commission can assist low-paid and award-reliant workers to meet their everyday living costs, and that helps to ensure that their needs are adequately protected. The Minister notes that the most recent seasonally adjusted estimate of average weekly ordinary time earnings in Western Australia is $1,895.80 per week, or approximately $98,900 per annum. By contrast, full-time median earnings in Western Australia were $1,600 per annum in August 2021. That was the latest median figures, and that equates to approximately $83,500 per annum. At the same time, the state minimum wage is currently a little over $40,600 per annum, and the C10 classification, the skilled tradesperson's classification, is a little under $46,300 per annum. As also outlined in the Minister's primary submission, the most recent data indicates that award-reliant employees in Western Australia have much lower average earnings than those employed on collective agreements and individual arrangements. In fact, ABS figures from May 2021 indicate that in WA, award-only employees earned an average of $28.90 per hour, while those engaged on collective agreements received an average of $47 per hour. And those working under individual arrangements, which includes over-award arrangements, earned an average of $46.20 per hour. So minimum and award wage earners are not highly paid by any measure, so it's appropriate their wages be adjusted by a fair and reasonable amount in this year's state wage case. The Minister contends that doing so will help to satisfy the objectives prescribed in Section 50A of the Industrial Relations Act in a considered manner. The Minister's written submission includes detail on apprenticeship and traineeship commencements and numbers in training. This information and analysis was provided by the Department of Training and Workforce Development, and the Minister thanks the Department for providing this information. As outlined in the Minister's submission, apprenticeship and traineeship commencements increased substantially in 2021, which was a very encouraging sign. Traineeship commencements increased by over 5,000 persons in 2021 alone, while apprenticeship commencements increased for the fifth year in a row. The increased uptake of training opportunities complements a variety of financial incentives and support payments made available to employers and employees to upskill the state's workforce. And indeed, I believe Unions WA outlined some of those in their submission. The total number of West Australians presently engaged in training also increased by almost 8,000 persons in 2021. And the Minister is pleased to note there's been increases in a range of skilled trades, including automotive, electrical, building, construction, and metals and manufacturing. With skill shortages evident in a wide range of sectors, it's especially important that training wages continue to be adjusted as part of the state wage order to facilitate the uptake of vocational education and training opportunities in Western Australia. And an updated schedule of the registered training packages and industry skill levels was appended to the Minister's...
Yes, thank you very much for that.
No problem. Thank you, Chief Commissioner. for use in the state wage order. One issue which I'll just touch on is the issue of a minimum wage for employees with a disability. As a further consideration in this year's state wage case, there's legislative change that will shortly require the Commission to set a minimum wage for employees with a disability. On 22nd of December 2021, the Industrial Relations Legislation Amendment Act received royal assent. Once the relevant provisions of the Act are proclaimed, the Commission will be required, as part of the state wage order, to set a minimum wage for employees with a disability whose productive capacity is being assessed under the supported wage system as being reduced because of a disability. The minimum amount set by this Commission must be the same as that set by the Fair Work Commission in the National Minimum Wage Order. This amount's currently $90 per week and will be reviewed as part of this year's annual wage review. It's anticipated that the National Minimum Wage Order will be issued sometime around mid-June this year. The Minister is hopeful that the relevant provisions of the Industrial Relations Legislation Amendment Act requiring the Commission to set a minimum wage for employees with a disability will be proclaimed prior to the 30th of June this year, which would affect this year's state wage order. The Minister will keep the Commission and other parties informed of developments concerning this throughout the course of the state wage case proceedings, and we remain available to assist with any matters regarding these provisions. Unfortunately, we don't have an exact date of when proclamation will occur, but we will certainly keep everybody informed.
No, thank you for that.
When that happens. Another issue that I'll just briefly touch on is the equal remuneration principle. When the relevant provisions of the Industrial Relations Legislation Amendment Act are proclaimed, the Industrial Relations Act will specifically require the Commission to include an equal remuneration principle as part of the statement of principles to guide the use of a new head of power that will enable the Commission to make equal remuneration orders. As an equal remuneration principle has already been included in the statement of principles since 2019, this requirement has effectively been met. And I also note that the new the principle for equal remuneration will actually apply not just when adjusting award rates, but that particular principle will apply across the board to all equal remuneration matters, whether or not they're award-based or not. To ensure consistency with the new equal remuneration provisions, the legislative provisions coming into effect, the Minister's reviewed the existing equal remuneration principle and suggested several very minor technical amendments, and these were included in Attachment D of the Minister's written submission. I should note there was nothing of substance in the changes. They were very technical. It was simply
reflecting the amendment.
Amendment to the legislation. I'll now briefly address the positions of the other parties and their submissions. In its submission, the CCI advocates for a flat dollar wage increase that meets the needs of the low paid and promotes a fair system of wages and conditions of employment by not disadvantaging small business operators through a higher minimum wage. In doing so, the CCI encourages the Commission and Court Session to adopt a cautious approach in reviewing the state minimum wage and award rates of pay, taking into consideration a variety of factors outlined in its submission. The Minister's already provided written comment on the CCI's initial submission, so for the sake of expediency, the Minister defers to that submission in reply for further information. The Minister notes that Unions WA recommends the Commission increase minimum and award wages by 7.6% in this year's proceedings. A 7.6% increase would amount to a $59.20 increase in the state minimum wage, and it would obviously be higher for wage rates that are above the minimum. As the Minister's already provided comment on Unions WA's submission earlier in proceedings, we also refer to the Minister's earlier submission reply for further information in that regard. As with Unions WA, WACOS also proposes a 7.6% increase in the state minimum wage, albeit it hasn't specifically proposed a particular increase for award wages above that level. The Minister acknowledges the detailed information provided by WACOS regarding living costs and inequality and poverty amongst marginalised and vulnerable members of the community. The WACOS submission provides some valuable background information for the Commission's consideration as part of the Section 50A criteria for the state wage case. And Professor Alison Preston from the University of Western Australia also made a submission to the Commission to assist with this year's state wage case deliberations. While most of this submission concerns public sector wages, which aren't specifically the subject of today's proceedings, the Minister concurs with the comments of Professor Preston regarding the important role of the state minimum wage, providing a safety net for low-paid workers in Western Australia, particularly those in award-reliant industries. Before I finish, I'll just briefly touch on some research commissioned for this year's annual wage review. And I believe this was something that you were interested in hearing about, Chief Commissioner.
Yes, thank you.
To assist the expert panel with the annual wage review, the Fair Work Commission recently commissioned some research into cost of living changes concerning low-paid households. And this was carried out by academics Kelvin Yen and David Rosenbees. The research found that although low-paid employee households have higher expenditure on non-discretionary items than other households, overall the differences in changed living costs have not been significant in recent years. Variations in living costs between low-paid employee households and other employee households were mainly attributable to changes in the price of certain items, such as tobacco, mortgage interest and childcare, and how particular items are categorised can make a difference in that regard. While changes in living costs were not significantly different, low-paid employee households do spend a higher proportion of their disposable income on non-discretionary items and a lower proportion on discretionary items. That's perhaps not surprising when consideration is given to the expenditure patterns of workers who generally have less income they can devote to discretionary items. So some of those discretionary items, such as international travel and what have you, certainly saw a lower proportion of expenditure on those items from low-paid households. So Yen and Rosenbees did note that inflation was relatively low in the years that their research covered, which may partly explain why there were only small differences in the cost of living between low-paid employee households and other households. And they did note that differences in the cost of living between different household types may be greater during a period of higher inflation. So further research on this issue may be warranted in future years to contribute to our understanding of cost of living issues affecting low-paid workers.
Yes, I think the authors were particularly noting in their research the impact on mortgages and rents, in other words, housing costs, as being a big component of low-paid income household costs.
Absolutely, Chief Commissioner, yes. And that's something that might be interesting if that exercise was undertaken again in future years, then you might see some different patterns starting to show up in that regard. In conclusion, the annual state wage order plays a critical role in maintaining a strong and sustainable safety net of wages and conditions for West Australian workers. Legislative amendments that are soon to take effect will further enhance the importance of the state wage order, including through the establishment of a minimum rate of pay for employees with a disability working under the supported wage system. The Minister supports the Commission taking a fair and balanced approach to minimum and award wage setting, including consideration of all of the social, economic and industrial objectives prescribed in Section 50A of the Industrial Relations Act. The Minister notes that further key sources of labour market data have just been released in the last 24 hours, And while national accounts data for the March quarter of 2022 will be released on the 1st of June. These data sources are also relevant to the Commission's deliberations, as is the Fair Work Commission's decision in the annual wage review, which is expected to be handed down sometime around mid-June. The Minister looks forward to making further contributions to this year's state wage case proceedings in due course. The Minister has no proposed changes to the Statement of Principles other than the minor technical amendment to the equal remuneration principle discussed earlier. The Minister has no further substantive information for these proceedings, or for today's hearings, but reserves the right to respond to matters raised in the presentations of the other parties. If it pleases the Commission and Court session, that concludes the Minister's submission.
Thank you, Mr. Hinton. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Moss.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. So I'd like to reiterate that TTI does rely, of course, on its submissions and reply in this matter. We note that this year's state wage case is occurring at a time of substantial uncertainty. We're facing a strong economic growth, thanks predominantly to the mining sector, but also declining business confidence and expected decline in profit margins as businesses face supply chain disruption, rising costs, labour shortages and the ongoing disruption associated from COVID-19. Likewise, employees are benefiting from higher levels of employment, which is encouraging a greater proportion of the community back into the labour market. But at the same time, we're also experiencing a significant fluctuation in working hours as well. The Commission and Court session is, I think, in an unenviable position in trying to determine what is an appropriate increase to the state minimum wage and award rates of pay, in particular with respect to this year's proceedings. A focus simply on economic growth, headline inflation and employment growth is likely to guide the Commission towards an outcome that we believe will ultimately disadvantage WA workers and business covered by the state industrial relations system. We believe that the Commission does need to take a more cautious approach and look behind the headline figures to consider the challenges and uncertainties facing workers and businesses which are covered by the state industrial relations system, and the role of other measures that are being utilised to address things such as cost of living pressures. And we note that challenge is clearly identified in Mr. Christmas's comments about some of the competing data that's currently before the Commission. Turning to the parties' positions, before I sort of focus on then some of our key elements that we'd like the Commission to take away on this matter. We recognise the Minister's positions with respect to this year's state wage case and the difficulty in specifying a quantum or a position from a numerical value. Whilst the approach adopted by the Minister and CCI in this year's submissions are a change from the normal practice, it is a recognition of the difficulties faced in making such a recommendation. Turning to the details of the Minister's submission, we believe that it's important to play the role of the mining sector in driving WA economic growth, and also the favourable position that the mining sector and resource sector broadly is playing with respect to the level of state finances. The fact that the mining sector currently accounts for 47% of the WA economy is a significant risk factor. And if we are looking at things like business investment, we do note, of course, that investment in the mining and resource sector generally does have a flow-on effect. One of the key challenges facing the WA economy is the lack of diversification that we have in it, and the lack of investment in other parts of the economy is something which is of concern. You know, there would be a much greater benefit for other sectors of the economy if there's direct investment in those areas. And that's why the state government's focus on seeking to diversify the WA economy is an important strategy in that respect. And I think in particular with respect to the role of the state wage case, it's looking at the state of the economy as it applies to those businesses which are most likely affected by this decision. We also say that the risks associated with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic shouldn't be downplayed, particularly its effect on those industries most likely to be affected by this decision as well. In his reply submission, the Minister has concurred with CCI that the temporary reduction in the fuel excise has helped relieve cost of living pressures for employees in terms of motoring costs. And he's also identified that they do have benefited employees in a similar manner. But on this point, what I would like to add is that the benefit to businesses has been a reduction in the pressure on them to increase prices as a result of increased transportation costs. So the excise here, the reduction in the excise is actually helping to dampen some of those inflationary pressures that we might otherwise have seen had they been maintained at their current level. We do disagree with the Minister's view that a significant increase to the minimum wage will draw more people into the labour market. We're already seeing exceptionally high levels of workforce participation, and any significant increase is unlikely to draw more people in, particularly noting that the minimum wage and the award conditions already provide a significant benefit to people who are working when compared to living standards of people who are reliant solely on government support payments. We do, however, believe that other measures are needed to unlock the disincentive to some groups of employees in returning or coming into the community, into the workforce. So, in particular, there's a hesitation by a lot of people who are reliant on government support payments to either engage in paid work or to increase their proportion of time in paid employment, because the impact of that has then on their government support payments. So targeted initiatives that look at seeking to reduce some of those disadvantages or disincentives are more likely to have the benefit of increasing labour force supply than changes to the state minimum wage. As far as the proposed changes to the state wage case principles with respect to equal remuneration, we have since had the opportunity to review those proposed amendments and we have no objection to them.
Thank you.
Turning to the position of Unions WA and WACOS, both of these organisations are seeking an unprecedented 7.6% increase to the state minimum wage, and the award rates are paid, in our opinion, based predominantly on the March quarter CPI. We note the Minister's concern and the concern or the comments raised by Mr Christmas today as well on basing a wage claim solely on a single quarter's results, noting the volatile one-off factors which have resulted in the spike for the March quarter. It is our view that there is a significant level of amber in the claim, and that in essence what both parties are seeking to do is to signal that they're hoping for a generous increase as a result of this year's state wage case decision. We believe ascribing a figure to a claim, particularly an amber one, is not of any greater assistance to the Commission than choosing not to provide a nominated position. As in previous years, Union WA has asked the Commission to disregard CCI WA's submission based on unspecified failure of our submission under the Act, rather than addressing the issues that have been raised in our submission. If Unions WA are particularly of the view that our position should be disregarded, we believe the onus is on them to clearly make that case. In our opinion, we don't think they have done so. Unions WA has also asked the Commission not to take into account the impact of the tax transfer system in helping to address cost of living pressures. Citing an opinion expressed by the Australian Institute, the tax cuts can't replace wage increases. Now, whilst we do have a significant level of concerns with this report generally, it is important to note that we're not asking the Commission not to grant a wage increase. Rather, the perspective that we're putting in is that in making its decision, it's important that the Commission recognise the role of the tax transfer system in providing targeted assistance to help address cost of living pressures. So in particular, if we're looking at the recent WA budget with the provision of the $400 grant for electricity or credit for electricity costs. This identifies a very targeted approach in addressing that particular concern and in essence, should also address waste costs concern with respect to the level of disconnections that are occurring through synergy. That's an example of how the tax transfer system can provide a very targeted response, whereas in comparison, increases to the minimum wage are a relatively blunt instrument in dealing with specific concerns that WACOS quite rightly has raised regarding particular segments of the community and some of the struggles that they are facing. Some of these struggles that these people these groups are facing, they are legitimate and valid concerns within that group, but those concerns can be better addressed through more targeted responses than simply increasing in wages. Unions WA in its submission also makes reference to a range of government initiatives targeted towards employers. Now, it should be noted that the majority of these are aimed at partially addressing the impact arising to businesses as a result of COVID-19 restrictions. They're not provided as a result of increasing or rising business costs. They're very targeted. Whilst those initiatives are very much welcomed, our experience has been they've not compensated the full cost to many of these sectors which have been adversely impacted by restrictions as well. So we're not comparing apples with apples in that respect. We also do note that the payroll tax waiver is not likely to assist the small businesses affected by this decision. It's aimed towards larger organisations. And likewise, the wage subsidy for apprentices is aimed at further encouraging employment growth in this sector. So the government subsidies in that respect are not necessarily designed to benefit employers. It's to remove the disincentives in employing apprentices and therefore encourage and foster greater investment in training of apprenticeships and traineeships, which benefits not only the workers themselves, but businesses and the wider community as well.
Which appear to have had some measure of success based upon the data before us.
Most definitely.
Good thing, I might add.
Well, I think it is a very good thing, and it's a good example of those very targeted responses having the designed effect. Our experience has been people choose to go into apprenticeships not because of the rate of pay they receive whilst they're an apprentice, but the benefits that that has on them for their future employment prospects and earnings potential once they finish that apprenticeship. That is the key driver in that respect, and the key driver for employers investing that is a long-term skilled workforce. These incentives really do benefit everybody. With respect to WACOS's submission and to a certain extent with Unions WA submission, we'd also just highlight or distinguish the difference between low-income households and those people who are reliant on the state minimum wage. The two groups aren't necessarily the same. Low-income households tend to be far broader and will, of course, incorporate a number of people who aren't in the paid labour market as well. So what we're basically saying is caution needs to be had in considering that information. Turning to our key argument, I'd like to sort of highlight some of the key elements of our submission. I'm not going to seek to talk to it in full. But the first one I'd like to highlight is some of the key challenges facing WA business community. Really, in spite of probably all of our hopes and expectations in entering into 2022, the worst of COVID-19 is certainly not behind us. And regrettably, this is the third year in which these proceedings are occurring in the context of a global pandemic, which continue to pose challenges not only for employers, but also workers and the community, of course, as a whole. Last year, we were facing a situation which WA had experienced very low levels of community transmission. And there are a variety of reasons for this, but not least, of course, being the government's restrictions, which are aimed at eradicating the spread of COVID-19. For WA employers and employees covered by the state system, things like snap lockdowns, mask mandates did create ongoing uncertainty and costs as businesses were forced to shut down or curtail their service offerings with very little warning. WA's closed border, which of course was the government's largest restriction, also impacted significantly on these sectors and the broader economy as well, by reducing the supply of labour along with reducing the level of interstate and overseas visitors. Now, the nature of the COVID-19 pandemic has significantly changed since then. Lockdowns, fortunately, are no longer a feature of the WA government's response to the management of COVID-19. Having said that, though, throughout the course of the beginning of this year, other restrictions, combined with wider spread community transmission, has had a significant impact on the business sector, particularly some of those businesses covered by this order. The belated opening of WA's borders was also a welcome move, although the delay in this occurring and the lack of a clear date, as well as some of the administrative requirements initially associated with travel into Western Australia, meant that the effects of the closed border policy are still being felt at the moment. The government's decision to ease the mask mandate and ease capacity rules have also been a welcome relief for many businesses, particularly those in the retail, hospitality and personal services sector. But there is a very real concern that these restrictions will be introduced based on the current levels of community transmission and hospitalisation rates. We note that the state's 7-day moving average has increased to 14,570 new cases per day, which is substantially higher than the current levels in other jurisdictions. So Victoria still has a high number of daily case rates at around 12,750 as its 7-day moving average, and 10,800 cases in New South Wales. So as a proportion of the population, the infection rate per day is 0.55 per 100 persons. So effectively, one person every 200 is contracting COVID each day. This is a really high level within Western Australia and is having an ongoing impact on our workforce. It's also having an ongoing impact on the way in which consumers are behaving. This increase is also coming at a time when we're entering into traditional flu season, with there being noted an increased risk associated with people contracting both the flu and COVID at the same time and the potential impact that that might have. We also note that hospitalisation rates are on the rise, currently sitting at an average of around 301 cases as a moving average. These are concerning developments that are occurring within COVID-19 and really indicates for us that things are not clear as to how this will pan out, but it is something which is very concerning to the business community and is directly affecting on business confidence. Things like mask mandates and capacity limits do have a very real impact on business. As our submission identified, mask mandates alone reduce consumer spending by an average of 35%, with the greatest impact being on industries such as cinemas, bars, cafes and restaurants, and of course leisure activities. It's also, as I said, altered consumer spending habits and behaviours, with a significant and understandable decline in the number of people wanting to attend large events, dine out or socialise in a pub, or visit major shopping centres. Rather, what we're seeing is an increased use of online spending and a greater propensity for people to put money aside in savings. We are also seeing an increased impact on labour supply, insofar as much greater proportion of people are unable to attend work either because they've contracted COVID-19 or caring for someone who has contracted COVID-19. We do note Mr Christmas's comments that we're yet to see some of that coming through in the official labour force data. The current report released today, of course, will need a bit more consideration in that front, but we expect that will flow through and we'll see that more readily as well. And I think, for the purposes of the Commission, if we look at small businesses operating in the CBD, the effect is quite obvious as well, with declined traffic in that respect, particularly as an increased proportion of the workforce seeks to work from home. Of course, it's worth noting that it's not only COVID-19 that's creating a risk for the business community. As the Minister and Mr Christmas have identified as well, businesses are also being impacted by the global and domestic supply chain disruptions. And these continue to be an ongoing problem, even with the resolution of the East-West Rail network. The delay effects is still being felt through. Labour shortages and, of course, rising business costs as well. Turning to the state of the WA economy, it's important to note that really the whole is made up of the contribution of each of its components, and not all industries have the same impact on the economy, which is increasingly the case with the dominance of the mining industry and its contribution towards the overall economy itself. As identified earlier, this lack of diversification is something which is a real concern to us. We'll talk a little bit more about the state of the economy as the national accounts data is released in June, so I don't want to talk too much about that. We'll have a better discussion at that particular point. Turning to a system of fair wages and conditions, in the current environment, we believe a fair system of wage and conditions is one that addresses the need of the low paid, but also manages the risk posed by high wage growth on the rate of inflation as well. Much has been said about the growth in wages as measured by wage price index and the low expected increase in yesterday's figures. Mr Christmas, I think, has identified quite nicely the limitations of the wage price index figure, and we have covered those in our submissions as well. And we do note the graph by Mr Christmas with respect to labour market supply and wage price index growth historically, and the expectation that as that pressure increases, wage price index will also increase in line with that. Both the Reserve Bank and Treasury have noted, as have our CCIWA submission, that there has been an increasing use of alternative measures to provide increases to employees. Our view is that the use of alternative measures, such as bonuses and the like, is not an inferior option. It's just simply different. It has different effects. We certainly do note that. But what we are seeing is that, taking into account things like the level of uncertainty that businesses have, the need to attract people, there is a need to look at other mechanisms to reward and compensate and attract people other than just simply looking at increasing the base rate of pay. And some of those measures are being utilised.
I suppose one of the issues in my mind there is the extent to which those measures are taken in certain industries or in certain occupational groups, as opposed to those who might be in the minimum wage earning strata. And might be a question that needs to be grappled with, I suspect. Yeah.
One of the challenges when we are looking at things such as of this type of nature is that a lot of this material isn't reported and difficult to then identify and also quantify to that extent. It will, of course, fluctuate depending on the type of employees and demand for that labour and skills and those types of things. But anecdotally, our view is it is impacting on award-based employees as well, particularly those which have a higher skill level too. I'd also pick up the comment that Mr Christmas has made, and we've also observed, is what wage price index doesn't measure is people taking the opportunity to move between jobs. And as skilled workers get sucked up into other aspects of the economy or, in other industries, then that is backfilled quite often by people who have less experience. but then they're able to benefit by moving up into higher paying roles, notwithstanding the lack of experience. So there are flow-on effects in that respect. So we do anticipate that we will see that. Some of the level of uncertainty that we have within the economy at the moment is probably encouraging towards short-term allowances and bonuses. On the basis that the economy continues to grow, then of course there'll be a demand and a pressure for that then to be converted into permanent increases through increased wages and the like as well. Okay, in a period of uncertainty, you're not going to commit to increasing all of your employees' wages when you're not sure whether or not the market might need to rectify or change that. Okay, and to a certain extent, there's been a little bit of a lessons learned from the collapse of the resources boom going back a number of years ago here in Western Australia, where we suddenly saw people being paid well above market. So that is a matter that does need to be considered in. The approach of taking different ways of remunerating people also has an impact, I believe, on the signalling effect that the state minimum wage has on wage growth generally. When we're seeing significant variations in the way in which people are compensated other than a direct increase in their base rate of pay, then that suggests that the signalling effect through things such as the state wage case order or the annual wage review are less strong. Looking at meeting the needs of the low paid, we do know that Australia continues to have one of the highest hourly minimum rates of pay of any OECD country, based on purchasing power parity. Now, despite the Minister's objection to considering how WA and the national WA state minimum wage and the national minimum wage compares to other countries, we do believe it is a relevant consideration. I also note the Minister's concern that in doing so there are differences in how employment arrangements are regulated between different countries, and this is true. But it should also be recognised that the Australian system of awards and legislative minimum standards do provide a high level of regulation and entitlement compared to many other jurisdictions as well. We also do note that state wage case decisions have also generally outpaced inflation, resulting in net improvements in the standard of living for the low paid. In particular, looking over the last 10 years, growth in the state minimum wage has exceeded both annual inflation and average wage growth. Take into account the impact of cost of living increase and that these will be felt most felt by those on lower incomes, we submit that a flat dollar increase is the most effective manner in addressing the needs of the low paid, rather than as a percentage-based increase, which will then affect wage rates across the award spectrum.
Would that be less inflationary?
Sorry?
Would that be less inflationary?
Yeah, that's our view, is that a flat dollar increase is less likely to have that inflationary effect, is less likely to trigger the concern around with respect to a wage spiral, because a flat dollar increase would be a relatively higher percentage for someone on the state minimum wage compared to a C10 or, for that matter, a C5 equivalent employee as well. So it's sending a different messaging. It's sending a messaging that you're targeting those at the lowest levels and probably those who are most likely to be impacted by cost of living pressures. In that, we do note the Commission's previous concerns regarding maintaining award relativities, but our view is that in the current environment, meeting the needs to the low paid has a greater priority. We also think that a flat dollar increase is a more effective strategy to address Unions WA and WACOS's concern about the gap between the state minimum wage and average earnings. Whilst a percentage-based increase is advantageous to Unions WA in terms of bargaining for industrial instruments, particularly with respect to, I think, its ongoing negotiations with the public sector on wage policy, We don't believe it's an effective mechanism in addressing concerns regarding the minimum wage bite. Rather, it's likely results in that gap continuing to increase, particularly if you do take into consideration signalling effect. If you're pushing for, and I'll simply use Unions WA's claim of 7.6%, that if you're seeing that type of increase applying to much higher rates of pay, say negotiated in enterprise agreements, then clearly that gap is certainly not going to improve. A flat dollar increase is a better way of seeking to narrow the gap on the basis that the Commission is of the view that, that gap needs to be reduced. If it pleases the Commission, those are the key points I'd like to raise as part of that, and most of the other points are referred to our submission, if the Commission pleases and if there's no other questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr Moss. Dr Diamond, do you want to kick off now? It's almost 10 to 1. Do you want to get underway now? And then we'll break. We normally break at 1 p.m. for a lunch break. So.
Thank you very much, Chief Commissioner. I might just borrow a...
Of course, please do.
Thank you. May it please the Commission in court session. Unions WA, like other parties, is relying on its initial submissions and submissions in reply to make its main points regarding our claim to increase the statutory minimum wage in WA and award wages by 7.6%. This would be an increase of $59.20 per week at the C14 level. And of course, within our initial submission, we did prepare a table showing how that plays out at higher award levels using the Metal Trades General Award. I might just move to get out of the way the issue around award relativities and having a percentage rather than a flat dollar amount increase. Our view is that maintaining margins for skill and proportions between award classifications are a worthy objective in their own right and certainly consistent with the Act. The argument that a flat dollar increase will compress those wage rates is certainly true in a mathematical sense, but we do not accept the proposition that the burden of sort of promoting egalitarianism, if I could put it like that, is solely the preserve of the award system. Insofar as Chamber of Commerce agrees with us that a higher proportion of the minimum wage to median and average weekly earnings would be a more desirable. We are more than happy to form a common view that a goal of the minimum wage should be a living wage, aiming at possibly 2/3 of median or average incomes. And this should be an explicit goal. That would be a better way still of ensuring a sort of more egalitarian distribution within the labour market. But in seeking to, so our view is that it should be a percentage increase. Our view is that this should be a percentage increase that is applied sort of up the classification levels. And we contend that it should be that the increase this year to the minimum wage and other awards rates should be a substantial one. Now, just to once again reiterate the points that we made in our reply submission about the lack of a figure from the government, from the Minister and the CCI. We do not resile from our view that Section 50 parties particularly have a responsibility to nominate a figure, while we recognise that it's not a specific requirement of the Act. We think that sort of adopting a cautious approach on the volatility of the prevailing economic climate is not really good enough. If you're coming here, you ought to be prepared to nominate a figure. The Commission, of course, may make a decision and will not necessarily go for any of the figures that we would go to once it's heard all the evidence. But really sort of claiming to help the Commission by not nominating a figure we don't think really stands up. Volatility, of course, can be on the upside as well, and volatility certainly appears to be what has been happening with the last few economic statements that have come out from the WA government, in that growth seems to be revised up rather than down. We acknowledge that, of course, in the federal system there is a practice of governments not providing a figure to the Fair Work Commission. Governments of both political persuasions, but we don't regard that as a particularly good development either, and we don't think it should be repeated and promoted here in the WA system. Only Unions WA and WACOS, of course, have made a specific claim, and that claim is for a 7.6% increase. In our submissions, we've made the case that wage growth and WA and the West of Australia needs the decisions of binding institutional measures such as the minimum wage. There is a huge amount of inertia in both the public and private sectors that is holding back wage growth. And the chart on page 35 of the Department of Treasury's presentation very much demonstrates just how much recently wage growth or potential wage growth is being held back. The decisions made by governments and business owners, proprietors, to not increase the minimum wage reflect the fundamental imbalances of power within the labour market. Imbalances of power that institutions such as the Industrial Relations Commission are meant to address. These are imbalances that make workers price takers within the market. Now, the analysis that workers are price takers, even in a notionally tight labour market, is not unique to Unions WA. It arises out of the latest economic research conducted on the minimum wage. In the economics field. This was recognised late last year by the Central Bank of Sweden's prize in the economic sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel 2021, one half of which went to David Card of the University of California. He and the late Alan B. Kruger analysed the labour market effects of minimum wages and showed, among other things, that increasing the minimum wage does not necessarily lead to fewer jobs. This, by the way, is what the CCIA seeks to disparage by its reference in its supply submission to US-based theory of the monopsony labour market, as if the US economy exists on another planet compared to that of Australia or indeed Western Australia. For the record, one of the most prominent global researchers on monopsony and labour markets is Alan Manning, a professor of economics at the London School of Economics and one of Europe's most leading labour economists. The practice of using minimum wages in labour markets is not only common around the world, but is in fact spreading. In 1998, 17 out of 30 OECD countries have a minimum wage. In 2015, 26 out of 34 OECD countries had one. And the UK has a target for their minimum wage to be 2/3 of median hourly earnings by 2024. The OECD's publications on this topic are actually useful in demonstrating the changing consensus on the minimum wage. In 1994, the OECD Jobs Study said, if it is judged desirable to maintain a legal minimum wage, consider minimising its anti-employment effects. But by 2018, it was concluding in its job strategy publications that minimum wages can help ensure that work is rewarding for everyone and that adverse employment effects can indeed be avoided. However, as the Minister's reply submission points out, the CCI is quite happy to use international comparisons when asking the Commission to take into account, and I quote, fairness already delivered by the WA and national minimum wage compared to other OECD nations. In this case, we agree with the Minister that the relevant criteria concerning fairness, living standards and the leads of no paid are best discussed using domestic measures of social and economic progress. In any case, Unions WA does contend that it has provided evidence that workers in Western Australia are not being paid for the full value of their labour. In our initial submission, paragraphs 5.12, I should say, to 5.16, We reference internet vacancy data published by the federal government, which shows that WA has had the largest increase in job advertisements since before the COVID-19 pandemic of every state and territory jurisdictions. This includes occupations and skill levels more likely to be covered by minimum and award wages. But despite all of this, the state budget is still not forecasting any real wage growth until 23 and 24, and even then has of course pushed that back, or rather forward in time, from the mid-year review just of last year. So we think is of significance is the ABS wages price index data that was released on the 18th of May 2022. Unions WA is seeking to, table a short summary of this data for the benefit of the Commission.
Yes, thank you.
So, you've got nothing. I won't go over the figures, but altogether, but just to make some of those points that a lot of the most recent results for WA's wage rises using this widely recognised figure, which is the wage price index, are still considerably below what inflation is turning out to be. And I draw particular attention to the chart down the bottom there supplied by the ANZ Bank, which is basically showing that nationally we are looking at the largest fall in real wage growth for 20 years. So essentially, and if you turn to the other side, you'll see that while there are certainly wage rises in the private sector that are larger, 3.5%, these are happening in a smaller number of jobs or a smaller number of areas. So there is still a strong role for award-based increases to make their contribution to real wage growth, in our view.
We might mark this. Any objection to this going in? Anyone else at the bar table? You'll get an opportunity to comment on it, of course, in your reply submissions.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, on the basis of that, the document ABS release wages price index March 2022, submitted for consideration, etc., will be Unions WA1. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chief Commissioner. Essentially, while we have both federal and state governments making strong and indeed stronger forecasts for economic growth than just a few months previously, wages are not responding in ways that a supply and demand model of the labour market would expect. They are responding, however, in ways that a MNOPSI model would expect, which is why, once again, it's the institutional action to increase wages that are needed. The lack of responses by wages to growth in the economy and demand for labour is of significant concern, we would argue, not simply for workers, but for business, particularly smaller business, particularly if people are inclined to curtail their spending in response to real wage decline. And in the Unions WA reply submission, part 8, we reference the results of the ANZ Roy Morgan Consumer Confidence Survey. According to that survey, there was a decline in consumer confidence, dropping to its lowest level since mid-August 2020. And WA was one of the states in which it dropped. And the decline was mainly driven by drops in the sub-indices that capture the financial situation compared to a year ago, and whether it is a good time to buy a major household item. And if we're thinking of the sort of businesses that might be impacted by the state minimum wage, particular, some of those in those sorts of good sectors are not exclusively, but certainly likely to be impacted by a minimum wage decision.
Would that be a convenient time, Dr. Diamond? It's just after 1, so should we break now and resume at 2:15?
Certainly happy to do so.
All right, thank you. We'll resume at 2:15. Thank you very much.